I've known of Joe Bruchac's work for probably 15 to 20 years, and am delighted to welcome him here to the Mount. He is the author of over 130 books. He is a poet. He writes science fiction. Some of you know I've assigned Skeleton Man. He writes historical fiction. Some of you I've assigned The Winter People. He writes realistic fiction. Some of you have read Heart of a Chief and Eagle Song in my classes. He's retold folklore, and this afternoon Billy Bruchac and I will be using his story Turtles Race with Beaver, a Seneca tale. He writes biography. I've bought for my children, Jim Thorpe, and anybody who comes to a class of mine will know Crazy Horse's Vision before they leave. I don't care what I'm teaching. He writes picture books, but he also writes academic books. He does have a doctorate, and he's been an independent scholar since 1981. If you haven't read Roots of Survival, I strongly recommend that one. He is a flute player, he's a storyteller, and he's an environmentalist. 10 years ago, when I wrote a book called Encountering Children's Literature, an Arts Approach, I hadn't met Joe. I only knew his work. But I knew he was a lover of the arts and a lover of using the arts to approach literacy. So I got my gumption up and asked him if he would write the foreword of my book. And he agreed. And I thought today I would share with you a little bit of that foreword. And here is what he wrote 10 years ago. Over the course of the last few decades, I've sometimes found myself in the position of comparing the traditional American Indian way of teaching with that most common to the Western world, the way that has dominated American education, the way that a good many critics have said our country needs to get back to in order to, quote, preserve our competitive edge, unquote. That Western model is, put into a single word, didacticism. The teacher tells you what you need to hear, what you need to read, what you need to do, then you just do it that way. If you think you detect a bit of animosity on my part towards the more militant form of this cerebral laundering, blame it on those Sisyphean years of my own childhood when I suffered, snored, and retreated into my own imagination while being forced to roll the rock of rote up that endless hill. The American Indian model of education, an experiential model that my grandfather, Jesse Bowman, showed me without ever breathing a word about teaching, could not be more different. It is, quite simply, learning by doing. Whenever he did something, he always made sure that I knew he needed my help doing it. In Western education, if you want to learn something, you study it in a classroom. In American Indian education, you just do it, usually in the presence of someone who knows so well how something is done that they can sometimes draw you into the doing of it without your hardly ever noticing. A Pomo Indian basket maker teaching a workshop in basket making to a group of Anglo women began by telling them that they had to learn a certain song. But, one woman said, we just want to learn how to make a basket. No, you don't, was the reply she got. In American Indian cultures and communities, the so-called arts have never been separated from the rest of life or seen as a part of the curriculum. It can be sacrificed because we need to emphasize the real basics. I'll stop there, but I can't think of a better person to speak to the topic of this literacy conference, Embracing Equity Through Multimodal Literacies. Welcome, Joe Bruchac.
Hey good morning, everyone. Kwai kwai ni do ba, hello, my friends. And do Luisi Soza pala noke da hozid, ala ganago heyo. My name is Joseph, or the peaceful one, or the good mind. And Dai salatogi ala nobizombik. I come from a place called Saratoga, or the medicine spring place. Al noba nia. That means I am a human being. And that is how we all need to see ourselves and each other as human beings, as part of a circle that embraces many things. Very often the approach in education, as was very clearly pointed out in Jane's quote from that little intro I wrote for her, is very much a straight line. It's a straight line that is intended to lift us up from where we are to a higher level. That's why we always talk about higher education and gradation. And yet, it is important to remember that if you continue in a straight line, eventually you leave the Earth and end up in space, separated from everything. There has to be a curve in there somewhere. And that curve makes us rejoin the circle. Very often, too, we begin to spiral out of control. We begin to sort of go into this sort of what has been called a death spiral and end up heading into kind of a black hole. And that is when elders always told me what we need to do is simply turn around and go back the way we came and find ourselves on the circle again. I think that one of the problems that we've faced in education and in culture in the last century has been that idea that we have only one way to go, that we must follow that one way, and that if you follow that one way, you will succeed. The old idea, unfortunately, all new again, that we can discover how well someone has learned something by having them write words on a piece of paper. And that will indicate to us at the end of however many years or months of study that they have learned what they need to know in order to progress. And yet, when we look at life, we realize it is multidimensional. It is something that embraces all of the senses. One of our very old stories, the story of the creation of the person we call Gluskomba in the Abenaki language, is an example of that importance of knowing that we are part of a wider circle and not being cut off from that circle. So I'm going to tell you that story to begin with, and as I tell you that story, I want you to help me in this one simple way, because a story is always meant to be shared. I have to know that you're awake and listening, especially on a Saturday morning. So if I say ho, I want you to say hey, which proves to me you are still awake and listening to me and part of that story. Ho? Hey. A ago, they say, or as we say in the Abenaki language, know what? A long time ago, they say, the Creator, Kutsinawask, the great mystery, had shaped this earth. Some of the dust of creation remained on the hands of Kutsinawask, and brushing that dust off, that dust fell on the ground. It had such power, it began to shape itself. It shaped itself a body, shoulders, arms, hands, a neck, and a head, and then that dust sat up. Owanikia, said Kutsinawask, which means, who are you? But there was no answer from that dust that sat up because there were no openings in its head. And so Kutsinawask called the lightning down. It made two holes, one on either side of that being's head. 2 ears, the first 2 ears, one on either side, so you can always hear 2 sides of every story. But still, there was no answer to that question, Owanikia, who are you? So once again, the lightning came down, struck, a double bolt of lightning made 2 eyes. 2 eyes, to see things in depth, to recognize that which is far and that which is near. But again, there was no answer. So a third time, a double bolt of lightning came down, struck, and made 2 nostrils to discern that which is good to smell, that which is not so good, and tell the difference between the two. But still there was no answer to the question of Awanikia until finally one bolt of lightning came down and made 1 mouth. Just 1 mouth and 2 ears, because it's important to listen twice as much as you talk. 1 mouth and 2 eyes. We must observe the world in depth. Just as we listen to both sides, we must see the far and the near and tell the difference between 2 nostrils and 1 mouth, because it's important to know what you're smelling before you start talking about it. And with that 1 mouth, that one, Kluskomba, could answer. When the creator, Ktinoak, said, Awanikia, who are you? Kluskomba looked at himself and said, Ojiozolnia. I appear to be the one who just pulled himself together here out of this dust. Onda, Kluskombakia. No, you are the talker, the one who will tell the stories, said Kutsinoask. And so it is that Kluskomba was created. That's part of a very long story we tell in Abenaki traditions of how it came to be that that first being that walks around as we do came into being, created out of the earth, connected to the earth, given those same 7 holes that we have in our heads that we often forget to use. And when we look at life in depth, we see that life is, in fact, a circle. In fact, it is often said the circle is the proper way to see things. I was taught many years ago by a Mohegan Indian elder named Harold Tantaquidgeon. By the way, the last of the Mohegans has not yet been born. That, yeah, think about that. Yo, Fenny. Anyway, on the wall of his Tantaquidgeon Indian Museum in Uncasville, Connecticut, a little museum that he and his sister Gladys ran for many years. In fact, Harold lived into his 90s, and Gladys just passed away a few years ago at the age of 104. She was a trained anthropologist as well as the medicine woman of the Mohegan Nation. And on the wall of the museum, there was a cross drawn. Now, it was not the Christian cross, although when the first missionaries came, many native people greeted them warmly because they could see they had the sign of the 4 directions, and they realized the importance of the balance between earth and sky. They thought, this is good. These people really know something. They're wearing it on their chest. Au contraire, mon ami. But when they drew this cross on the wall of the Tantaquidgeon Museum, in each of its quadrants, they put a little circle. And Harold Tantaquidgeon explained those 4 circles stood for the 4 grandparents that we all have. We all learn from our grandparents, and our grandmothers and our grandfathers are of equal importance and must never be forgotten, that wisdom that passes down to us from their years of experience. And without them, we would not be. Important to remember. But also it stood for a progression which you can follow in learning. It could be the progression in learning to tell a story, or the progression in learning to be a human being, which in fact is the highest thing we can aspire to in education, to be al-mobak, human beings, to be people, part of a circle. The first quadrant stands for listening. You begin by listening. When I played this drum to start off, that drum beat is the same as the heartbeat. It is the first music we all heard. Even before we were born, we could hear our mother's hearts beating. So we say, I always say this, the drum beat reminds us, always listen to your mother. But we say the drum beat signifies the earth itself, who holds us as a mother does, who we come from and we return to. So an awareness of that environment that surrounds us, that earth that is beneath our feet, is a very important thing for all of us to keep in mind. And we must begin by listening, using those 2 ears to listen. In fact, the first thing that many of us listen to as children, perhaps not as much as we could, is storytelling. Stories are powerful engines of education. They have come into being through thousands of generations of experience. They survive as folk tales because they are effective. They are well structured and they are precise in their use. A story always does at least two things. A story that has survived to become part of what we call folk tradition. It is first and foremost entertaining. We cannot forget the importance of entertainment for our children and for ourselves. If we are not entertained, it is very difficult to retain. Entertain to retain. If you want to learn something, make the experience memorable and, if not pleasant, then maybe frightening. But you will remember it for sure. That's why ghost stories are part of all cultures. One reason, of course, there's many other reasons. One reason is they are very easy to remember. You will retain a ghost story. So a good story has to be memorable. But then a good story does something else. It instructs. It teaches. That little piece of a story that I told you of the creation of Clos Combat has so many elements just in that small piece I told you that are very deep teaching. You could spend a long time absorbing the teaching that was in that little snippet of a story. I sometimes will tell a story to a group of teachers and ask them to tell me what lessons they've drawn from it, and an hour later I'll say, that's enough. That's enough, because every lesson suggests another lesson. So that is one thing that you have in that mode of listening, the ability to hear a story. Remember, a good story, always, like a joke, has to be properly structured. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now that may seem very silly that I have to talk about that, but in fact, the most basic things are often the things that we don't pay enough attention to. If you begin to study martial arts, the first thing you're told is you have to learn how to breathe. But I know how to breathe. No, you don't. Because breathing, like anything, can be done properly or improperly. And therefore, we learn by listening and learn to listen by listening. It's an interesting bit of research was done a few years ago on boys who are having problems with reading. And you know, it's almost always the boys who have problems with reading. Very seldom is it the girls. And a couple of things were discovered. I'm sure you all know this, that brain research indicates that girls' brains develop differently than boys do. There is something about female hormones that makes a difference in that brain development. And as a result, the parts of the brain that connect together to make it possible to understand things, as in reading, eventually they're the same, but at a certain point, girls are far ahead of boys. Far ahead of boys, physically in terms of brain structure. So that means that a girl who is in third grade may be reading 2 or 3 grade levels against the same boy in that grade, ahead of that boy in that grade. But the idea that you can learn by hearing is important as well, because they've taken these classes of boys who are slow readers, and by simply reading to them, not asking them to read aloud, not quizzing them on what they read, just reading to them for half an hour or an hour a day, every aspect of literacy increases except for spelling. They become better readers, better writers, they can express themselves better just by being read to. And it's a popular part of the day for these boys. If you read something they enjoy, as long as you choose something they enjoy. Boys like to read certain things that girls often don't like to read. And I'm making a big generalization here. I know this, believe me, but it is, as a generalization, pretty true. And that idea that we learn by hearing is one reason why stories were told to boys and girls, because stories draw you in, and you are going to learn from hearing those stories. Another interesting thing about that research showed that boys tend to read and appreciate nonfiction more than fiction. They want to know how things are made, how things are put together, how things work, and therefore assigning a curriculum with nonfiction. One of the things that I like about the new Common Core is the emphasis, not to the exclusion of literature, but to the inclusion of nonfiction, because that is something which will definitely appeal to people who are reluctant readers, who are young men. They also like to read about things that are gross, things that are scary, all of that stuff as well. And I think that sports is another big thing. I work with a friend of mine named John Cheska. John's an incredible guy. He has a website, guysread.com, and I'm lucky enough to have a story of mine in the new anthology called The Sports Pages, stories about sports for boys. And John was chosen as the ambassador for reading a few years ago. We were both at the White House, and it was so funny because this is when George Bush was president. And John was asked to sign a book for George and Laura, that book of his, Knucklehead. He signed it to my two favorite knuckleheads, George and Laura. That's the only way you could get away with that. Well, let me continue a little further around that circle. I've mentioned listen. The second part of that quadrant was observe. To use your eyes, to really observe the world around you. That is something that often we do not do, and we need to be taught to do that. I remember back when I was a student at Cornell University, majoring in wildlife conservation for the first 3 years before I switched into English. I went into a class in ichthyology, and I walked into that class, and they handed me a fish. And they said, "This is your assignment for the week. Here's your fish. Sit at that table whenever you're in class and study that fish, and at the end of the week, tell me what you've discovered." That was it. I had to look at that fish, I had to touch that fish, I had to write what I saw about that fish. I found myself counting scales on that fish. At one point, I felt like I was going to hit myself over the head with that fish. But the point was, I was forced into close observation. And it was so much better than giving me a test and telling me the parts of the fish and pointing out to me certain things about that creature that I had not recognized before. By the way, it was preserved in alcohol, so it didn't smell bad by the end of the week. But that is an important thing, that we must observe closely. The most mundane things we often do not see. There is a term in Zen Buddhism, beginner's mind. And beginner's mind means looking at the world as if you had never seen it before. Observing things with the eyes of a child to whom all things are marvelous and new. My goodness, these lights are really wonderful. If you'd never seen electric lights. I was with a Mayan elder who had never been in an airplane before. And everything was wonderful to old John Keene. This is all so good. It's all so wonderful. Everybody else says, "Oh, we've got to get this flight over with." But it was like, "Oh, look at this little thing. Oh, look, a chair. No, it's a seat. Oh, wow." And that ability to see things as new means the ability to learn is part of it as well. Teaching observation, modeling observation. And this is, again, something from one culture to another. We may find different ways of doing it. I remember, for example, when I lived in West Africa, I was a teacher in Ghana for 3 years, watching a Ghanaian father teaching his son how to count. And he did it through a game. There's a game called Oware, which is played in Africa. It is a carved board which has hollows in it, and in each of those hollows are placed 4 seeds or 4 stones with one left open. And then you have to begin, you have one side with, say, 6 holes and the other side with 6 holes. And then by arranging those stones so they end in a hole that has 4 in it, you win those 4. And it's a counting game, and a very complex counting game. When you play it, I would play it, I could never win. And little 4-year-old kids are going, and that ability to perceive spatially and to see numbers through the use of manipulated objects is truly observation, seeing, and again, it's experiential. Now, the third part of that quadrant is very, very important. It is to remember. Memory is one of our most powerful tools. One of the problems I have with standardized testing, I observed when I was in school myself. I could take a test and get 100% and walk out of that classroom and it's all gone. If I were to take that same test the next day, I would not pass it because I had crammed it into my brain and then regurgitated it like a bad meal onto the page. And there it was, and I didn't remember it. I don't remember anything about the statistics course I had to take in college. Anything at all, except the one thing I remember is how you can estimate the number of animals or birds in a herd by just counting one section and imagining each section, putting it all together. I remember that, because that was something I could really see, but all those numbers, all those uses of them, it just went out of my head. It made no sense to me. And that idea of remembering was not part of it. Short-term memory for the purpose of a test is not true memorization. When you remember something, and I love memorizing things. I've always loved memorizing poetry. I was in high school sitting in the back of my English class reciting by memory whatever poem my teacher was reading from the book up front, 2 lines ahead of them. It made my English teacher love and hate me at the same time. He finally would have me come up front, just go do the poem, do the poem. I go, yeah, okay, you know. When I consider how my light has spent here half my years in this dark world and wide, you know. Or in other languages too. Frühling ist wieder gekommen, die Erde ist wie ein Kind, das Gedichte weiß. It's part of sonnets to Orpheus about spring. Spring has come again, the earth is like a child who knows poems by Rainier Maria Rilke. I just love that idea of memorizing. When I teach creative writing courses, I would always have my students choose at least 1 or 2 poems that they loved and memorize them, and then say them to the class. Because that process of memorizing and remembering makes it come alive for you much more than asking someone a bunch of questions about what do you think Milton means by this? And in Lycidas, yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more, ye myrtles brown with ivy never sere. What do those plants signify? Instead of loving the sound of the language and then proceeding to understand it even more through that love of the sound. That's why Shakespeare has survived for so long. His music of his plays is so beautiful, so tripping off the tongue that we remember it that way. Memory is a powerful thing. I discovered, by the way, when I taught in West Africa, that memory was a natural component of everyday life in Ghana. People took it for granted they could remember things. We don't rely on our memories. We rely now on our machines. We've got it here. This is where I remember it, right? But in fact, if you have it here and sort of here, then it is with you even when you are disconnected from the World Wide Web, because we remember more than we think we do. Has anyone ever asked you a question and you've suddenly blanked on it, just gone out of your mind, and then 5 minutes later, or maybe even 5 seconds later, it comes to you? There's this sort of block that we occasionally put up for ourselves in our memories, partially because we don't believe we can remember. We stress ourselves out of remembering. When I was teaching in Ghana in a secondary school, we were putting on plays. I was in charge of several things: the school band, I was the vocalist, the track team, I was the coach, and I was also the person who was in charge of the drama club. So we were putting on plays and traveling around Ghana. And because this was West Africa and part of the former British Empire, of course we had to do Shakespeare. So we were doing Macbeth. And the day before we were supposed to perform Macbeth, my Macbeth came down with laryngitis. But I'd been teaching it in this class of fifth formers, which is the equivalent of the senior year in high school. And so I said, okay, who wants to be Macbeth? And about 5 hands raised up. Because I had discovered a very cool thing that was talking about the differences in learning patterns. Whenever we did a play of Macbeth's, the kids would read it and memorize it. They literally would memorize the entire play, because no big deal. We do this all the time. We're used to remembering. And so I had 5 different choices for Macbeth, and I took the one who had the best voice, and he did great.
almost no prompting at all. He remembered the whole play. I mean, I remember once I first discovered this when I was teaching a class, and I said, well, in Hamlet, when he gives that speech to be or not to be, and this one kid said, wait. I said, what? He said, I'm trying to get to that point in the play. He was running through it in his mind, remembering from the beginning to the end where that took place. So remember. Remember you can remember. That's part of it. Remember you can remember. Memory is something that is given to virtually all of us unless we've had some kind of brain event that makes it difficult for us to remember. Now the fourth quadrant is a very powerful one. It is to share, to give back. That is one of the most important things to me in education. Not just learning for yourself, not just learning for the sake of learning or for your own advancement, but for completing that circle. Because that which is given to us, we must then give back. And I think everyone who is a teacher would agree that often the best way to learn something is to teach it. Because when we teach it, we have to understand it more than when we're just learning it for ourselves. And you have to sort of stay at least one step ahead of your students when you're teaching something. There was a novel written by John Barth called The Sotweed Factor a number of years ago. And it was about the events that took place in colonial New England that led to what was known as King Philip's War, and also the rebellion against Native and African slaves coming together and joining against the colonialists. A very interesting novel, historical novel. And in it, one of the main characters is called upon to teach the recorder, but he knows nothing about the recorder. And he has got to go out in front of a group of students and teach how to play this thing. And the person who's telling him how to do it says, well, look, just take the recorder and you hold it like this. This is how you hold it. That's what you teach your class the first lesson. Just teach them how to hold the recorder. And then I'll show you how to play one note for the next class. And each time you say, you just have to stay one note ahead. So he'll learn by that process of sharing. It's a lovely little analogy of what we sometimes do as teachers. We stay just a little bit ahead of our students. And if we've got really good students, we've got to really get ahead of them. But that idea that sharing is important also ties into another part of that image of that circle, that progression, beginning with listening, observing, remembering, and sharing, is that it comes right back to listening. It goes right back into that circle, and the circle goes around again. We often say in Native tradition that the idea of listening is the small child, observing is the young person, remembering is the job of the adult, and sharing is the job of the elder. Those are the four places around that circle that we find ourselves. We are, as human beings, constantly traveling a circle. In that circle, there are many places that we can find ourselves. And everybody, at some point or another, becomes a child again. We find ourselves in that position of having to once more learn where we are. Now, as a writer and a storyteller, what I like to do is to produce work that has something of that same structure. If I tell a scary story, for example, I have a novel called Skeleton Man. And Skeleton Man tells the story of a young woman who finds herself in a very difficult situation. Her parents have disappeared. She's been entrusted to the guardianship of someone who is very suspicious to her, and no one seems to understand her problem. There were several things in my mind when I wrote that story. One is that, of course, people in general like scary stories. And it encourages reading to tell a scary story. I love to encourage reading, and I love the idea that someone can learn at the same time. And of course, the lessons that my main character, Molly, learns are lessons that have come to her through storytelling, through the stories that were shared to her from her parents, lessons she remembers and then uses them to cope. I think that loss of parents is a common fear on the part of young people. Being misunderstood or being not listened to is a common experience on the part of young people. But what they don't often experience is that sense of accomplishment, that sense of being able to solve their own problems which my main character does through turning to tradition, through turning to storytelling, trusting her dreams, trusting the things she was taught. A lot of scary fiction has been written for kids, the Goosebumps series most notably. And while I appreciate very much that R.L. Stine did a really great blurb for me on the back of my novel, I have a problem with a lot of his books because there seems to be no purpose to them other than scaring people. There's no moral center. And there is a moral center in storytelling. I like to think there's a moral center in each book that I write because we have responsibility to those people who read our work. And for me, part of that responsibility is to remain true to whatever the cultural center is of a particular story I've told. If, for example, I do a picture book called Crazy Horse's Vision, I did that book based on stories I had heard over the years from Lakota elders about that man who was so Tashunkawithko, so important to Lakota people. And his image was never made. It's ironic that a mountain is being carved into his shape now, or supposedly into his shape, because a lot of Lakota people say, why would you do that when someone never even wanted his photograph taken? Yeah. You know, take a mountain and cut it all up and make it look like him. But again, it's not being carved by native people, but by non-native people to honor Indians. And I have a little bit of a Thoreauvian feel about that. You know, when people come to honor me, it's like what Thoreau said, someone comes to your house with the express purpose of doing good for you, leave by the back door. But that story was done with the help of a lot of people. I've always tried to listen to people in other cultures when I'm dealing with something that comes from another culture. That's something that I think that we can all do. We can listen better. We can pay closer attention, and it will prevent problems before they begin if we listen closely and pay attention. So when the time came for this picture book to be illustrated, the illustrator was S.D. Nelson, who is himself Lakota and a descendant of Crazy Horse's relatives, and he chose to present Crazy Horse not realistically, but stylistically, and to color him blue, to show blue as a color of power, a color of difference, a color of sacredness in Lakota color symbology. And to do it in the style of ledger book. Ledger books were drawings that were done in notebooks, that sometimes store record books that Lakota people got hold of, and with crayons and pens they drew pictures based on the same style they had done when they did pictures on buffalo skins, something called winter counts. You would do a drawing that illustrated something powerful that happened during one year or one winter to remember that. And therefore, you'll find this book illustrated in the winter count ledger book style to honor Crazy Horse's desire never to be pictured, to reflect Lakota culture, and to tell a story from a non-Western point of view, to look at things through different eyes. As Robert Burns said, to see ourselves as others see us. It's a great gift. Notice I didn't try to do that with a Scots accent. Oh, I'm not so good with a Scots accent. Part of the mystic, yes, never mind. But when we, as writers, as storytellers, and as teachers, present things from other cultures, we're doing something very important. We are broadening the vision of our students, but we have to broaden our own vision first. We have to see things ourselves more clearly. I remember, as if it were yesterday, an experience that happened to me in West Africa in 1968. I was teaching in Ghana, which is a country on the West African coast. It's a multilingual country, so much so that English had to be the lingua franca when it became a nation, because there were several very powerful different language groups, and you couldn't choose just one over the others. Because I was living in the Ewe region, I learned somewhat to speak the Ewe language and could understand conversation and didn't make all that many mistakes, although it's easy to make mistakes in another language. And one day I was riding in a bus in Ghana, in West Africa in those days, and still pretty true to these days. If you wanted to go anywhere, you just went out on the roadside and waited until one of these private Benz buses or VW buses went by with the name of your destination written on the side of it. You just wave at the bus, they'd stop, and you'd climb in and pay at that time the equivalent of a penny a mile to travel anywhere. There was a bit of research done that concluded that West Africans traveled farther, faster, and cheaper than any other people in the world at that particular time in the 60s and 70s. And as I sat down in that bus, there was an old man sitting across from me, an old Ghanaian man, and he looked it over at me and said, "Efon." I said, "Eh, me fon, efon." "How are you?" "I'm good." "How are you?" We went back and forth to the greeting and thought, "Oh, this is great. I'm really making friends with this guy." And then as we drove around, he got this big grin on his face. And he pointed at me, he said, "Gali." That means there is money. In other words, you're a wealthy dude. I go, "Ow, ow, 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 ow." No, I'm not, no, not me. I'm not wealthy. And he said, "Oh, yes, you are." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm just a poor American. You know, I'm just a student here. I'm just a teacher here. I don't get much money at all." And he said, all of a sudden, I realized I was in the middle of a Socratic dialogue. He said, "Will you answer a question for me?" I said, "Eh?" He said, "Back home in America, do you have a record player?" "Yes." "Back home in America, do you have a refrigerator?" "Yes." "Back home in America, do you have an automobile?" "Yes." "Back home," golly. To see ourselves as others see us is a very difficult thing. And I think that one experience taught me that we need to recognize where we are when we say who we think we are. This is certainly true in teaching as much as it is in the experience of travel. I should point out, too, that when you talk about storytelling, you talk about something that is universal. Wherever you go, stories are told. And one thing I encourage people to do is, if you're going to use storytelling, recognize that everybody has their own storytelling roots. Everyone does. In my case, my family has a number of different ethnic backgrounds. The name Bruchac is a Slovak name. In fact, Bruchac in Slovakia means big belly. Good Indian name. And I also have English ancestry. And I have Mohawk ancestry. I probably have Mohican ancestry. It's pretty clear, Scotticoke. And I have Abenaki ancestry. And as a storyteller and as a writer, I have spent decades learning everything I can about all of those sides of my family, including language. Language is such a powerful thing. You can learn so much by understanding other people's languages and what language means and how language works. It opens up the world to thinking of diversifying the circle. This country is language poor. We have got into this English-only idea. And yet again, if I can paraphrase some interesting research, it has been proven that people who are literate in one language are more likely to become literate in the other. That literacy in Spanish, in fact, increases your ability to be literate in English. It doesn't get in the way. If you are surrounded by English speakers, you are immersed in English, and anyone knows, take a kid in kindergarten or first grade, drop them in another setting, and they'll be speaking the local language within 6 months, if not sooner. We, when we are immersed in language, learn it. We don't have to get rid of other languages to make English better in this country. In fact, we may be having the opposite result by language repression. But language can help us see the world. Just let me give you a real quick example, very visual, thinking of different modalities. Within American Indian culture, we use the language of the hands. Here in North America alone, there were more than 300 distinctly different languages, and before Columbus, people traveled very widely all around this continent. We had great trade routes that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of Maine, from California all the way to the Midwest. And people traveled those routes, and they could not learn every language, although they often were multilingual, but they could communicate by using sign language. To say everything, you just do this. Everything or all. Everything is good. All's cool. It's all good. That's pretty visible, pretty easy to see. But sometimes it's really interesting. Like, for example, this sign which was used, by the way, all over North America, all the way up to Alaska. I've done sign language in Alaska, and elders have come up and said, oh, I'm so glad to see you doing the old trade language. I go, no, I didn't learn it in Alaska. Well, that's our language too. This means anger. It means your mind is circling back upon itself. That's anger. Different way to see anger, isn't it? Happiness is the sun is in my heart. Isn't that beautiful? Very poetic. And depression is the clouds are all around my head. That's so visible. When I do certain of my stories, I sometimes, with the little kids, because you know with kindergartners and first graders, they need to move. They need to move. By the way, thinking back about boys and learning, it was also proven through some interesting research that boys learn math faster if they're allowed to stand up and move around while they're learning math. And if a boy is tapping a pen or jiggling his foot up and down, it's actually a way of helping them concentrate. It physically aids in concentration. So when you tell that kid, stop jiggling your knee, Johnny, stop tapping that pen on the desk, Johnny, and when you're staring out the window, stop staring out the window. Actually, staring out the window is another way of making those brain connections work. And we don't understand that, and we're getting in the way of them trying to actually concentrate. So that idea that motion, that moving is part of it too, is very, very interesting, isn't it? When we consider language, I think that language has the power to move us and also to be misunderstood. And I wanted to share one little story about the Abenaki language, which is an example of that misunderstanding. I love to do it here at Mount St. Mary because most of my family on the Abenaki side was Catholic. And we were taught by Jesuits back in the old days. I wasn't, but my ancestors were. And the little town of Odanak in the province of Quebec, which is an Abenaki reserve, used to be called St. Francis. I'm so happy we have a Francis as a pope right now. It's so cool. My favorite saint, St. Francis. But this one particular Jesuit priest decided he would learn and incorporate the Abenaki language in his sermons to the congregation. So he began doing that. Instead of saying it in French, he would try to say it in Abenaki. And he noticed that the congregation was getting bigger. More people were coming, and they were, almost lining up to get in the church. And every time he would say, and the great mystery wants you to do this, everybody would go, By the way, if you say, try that, You're speaking Abenaki. That's yes, in the Abenaki language. It really is. And finally, one of his congregants took pity on him and said, Father, I need to tell you something. And the priest said, what is it, my child? He said, Father, your pronunciation is not so good. You are trying to say the name of the Creator, which is Kutsi Nawask. And you are saying Goji Nawask. Father, Kutsi, that means big. Goji, that means your butt. So whenever he said, Goji Nawask is listening, yeah, your butt mystery is listening. Hey, Goji Nawask will speak, it will speak. So quickly understood that he had to learn the language a little bit better. But as I was saying, storytelling is part of our human heritage all over the world. And I always tell people that there are 4 roots we can turn to for storytelling. And this is a great way, by the way, to generate writing. The first is Ancestry, which I've already mentioned. When you go around a group of kids that sometimes all look alike, and you ask them their ancestries, it's amazing the variety you'll get. I have been in classrooms where I've had 60 different ancestries among 30 kids. And they sometimes look at themselves, that's good, I can be proud of my French heritage. That's something I could look to. My Irish heritage, yes, And that idea of heritage, I say, where can you learn stories and songs and history? The library. Or if you're going to do a web search, make sure you do it with the help of your librarian, because the internet cannot be trusted. Always, there's a lot of traps out there. And that leads them to finding more. And sometimes at the end of a week, if I'm with kids for a bunch of time, they come back, their just eyes are glowing. I just discovered that I'm descended from a Viking. Cool. Don't watch Vikings on the History Channel, but never mind. If you're a fourth grader. The second root I always point out, and by the way, I say that remember, a tree only stands strong because it has roots. Those roots may not be seen, but they help the tree to stand strong. Never judge a person by how they look on the outside. You don't know what's in their heart or in their mind or in their background. And that's important too for kids to hear, because lots of people get judged by their appearance. When I was in school, I was a little kid. Everybody picked on me. Little kid with a big vocabulary. Then I got to my senior year in high school and I grew 6 inches in height and all of a sudden became an athlete. Then I went to college and everybody said, oh, dumb jock. All of a sudden I was on the other side of the stereotype. So fascinating. And my grandfather was very, very dark-skinned, very dark-skinned. And when he came to visit me when I was a student at Cornell University, my freshman year, he came with my 2 best friends, Tommy and David. Tommy was Irish-American, looked very Irish-American. David was African-American, looked very African-American. And my grandfather introduced them to everyone as my 2 brothers. And people would look at Tommy, then they'd look at me, they'd look at David, they'd look at David again, they'd look at David again. And my grandfather, they'd look at my grandfather. Could be, you know. And we just thought that was the funniest thing in the world until it came time for fraternity rushing, and no fraternities invited me to visit, because no African American students were allowed in fraternities at Cornell in the 1960s. And eventually someone found out it would just be my grandfather joking, and all of a sudden fraternities started inviting me to visit them. But it was a very interesting experience for me. Judging people by how they look is a very big mistake. The second thing I point out as roots is family. I've already mentioned a little bit about family there. And family is a powerful thing. We all have families. We all have relatives. We have families we're born into and families that are families of choice. So it's a little different than ancestry. And often family, you have stories of where people came from, stories of place, stories of origin, stories of travel, stories of immigration. I know a friend of mine named Steve Sandfield, who's a Jewish-American writer, tells a story of his uncle named Sean Ferguson. I said, oh, you have an Irish uncle? He said, no, what happened is my uncle was determined to speak English when he reached Ellis Island. And when he got to the person who was taking information down, all the English left his head. And the man said, what's your name? And he went, ach, Sean Ferguson. Oh, I've completely forgotten. Oh, Sean Ferguson. That's how he got his name. Now, a third source of storytelling, which everybody has, is place. The place where you live. Sometimes the name of the place is magical and has something to it that's really powerful. For example, there's a river that flows called Quanituk, Long River. That became Connecticut. That's where the state of Connecticut got its name, the Long River. Massachusetts is many small mountains. And Ohio is a beautiful place. Ontario is Ganyudayo, Mohawk or Seneca, which means it is a beautiful lake. Names are powerful things. Even your own name has something to go with that. But I also say one thing that's a place story which kids really respond to, and I always get them on this, is ghost stories. Getting back to ghost stories. Every place you go in the world, there's always ghost stories. I heard them in Africa, I've heard them in Europe, I've heard them all over North America. And ghost stories are a way that people really get across that curiosity we have about what happens after this life. I won't go into very quickly. I'm going to tell you one quick ghost story, and I know we're almost out of time. And that is when I was out in Mohawk, New York, there's a place called Beardsley Manor, which is an old mansion, which was a castle brought over from Ireland. And it was built on the site of a colonial fort that burned. And that was on the site of a native village that was burned. And Beardsley Manor itself constantly has fires, one fire after another. And it's a restaurant, it's a historical site and a restaurant now. And the restaurant manager died in the restaurant, and so his ghost is frequently seen there. A very tall man wearing a long black coat with a slouch hat pulled over his eyes, his fedora pulled down low. And when I went to eat there, because I'd been in the area for about a week doing programs in a school and hearing ghost stories from the kids about Beardsley Manor, I asked a waiter if he knew any stories, and I said, "Can you tell me any?" He said, "Why do you want to know?" I said, "Oh, I'm a storyteller, a writer." He said, "Well, in that case, I'll tell you a story or two, but just don't ever mention my name. I don't want anyone to think I'm crazy." So he told me story after story, but one of them was this. There was a new waitress who was hired who didn't believe in ghosts, and they told her about the restaurant manager, and she said, "Oh, you're just trying to freak me out." But one day she was alone in the kitchen by herself when she felt a cold breeze blow over the back of her neck. And she turned around, and there was this tall figure wearing a long black coat with a hat pulled over his eyes. She goes, "Okay, who is it? Jeff? Is it Fred? You're trying to freak me out. There's no way that you're going to," "Ah!" And then she screamed, kind of like that. Well done, Jane, well done. Yes, they call me the Maharishi. I make people levitate. That, by the way, in storytelling jargon is called a jump. And the reason she screamed is because just then that tall figure in the black coat left the room by walking through the wall. So from then on, she believed in ghosts. Now, the last route you can turn for storytelling is your personal experience. Those things that happen to you that are unique to you and to no one else. Those are your stories too. So remember that. Ancestry, family, place, and personal experience. And you can draw in so many different things. Let me conclude by sharing with you one more sound, and that's the sound of the flute. We say the flute brings together that breath that we all share, just as we all share the heartbeat, we all share breath. Leaves us, returns to us again. Inspiration, breathing in. And so that, by the way, I like to think that teaching is drawing out, educare. You know, we draw out, we don't just pound in. And we inspire by sharing. Thank you for listening.